Hi guys, I want to take a moment to give you a brief overview of the MakeNoise Ø-COAST. Now a little bit about the name. Some people call it the Ø-COAST, some people call it the Zero Coast, some people call it the No Coast. What's all this about coast? Well, in the very early days of analog synthesizers, end of the 1960s, early 1970s, there were two schools of thought about synthesizer design. On the East Coast, you had companies like Moog and ARP Instruments that were designing synthesizers with keyboards meant to imitate conventional instruments or play conventional music in a pop music setting. So very much aligned to the keyboard, 12-tone music. On the West Coast, you had companies like Buchla in the San Francisco area and Surge Modular in the LA area that were keyboardless synths and designed for more exploration of synthetic sounds. So Buchla felt very strongly that a synthesizer should not have a keyboard, that a keyboard in fact limits you to producing music that's playable on a keyboard. Whereas a synthesizer is a completely new instrument with completely new musical potential. So why would you want to limit yourself to a keyboard? A couple of other differences is that the East Coast synthesizers tended to start with a rich waveform, sawtooth, square, pulse wave, triangle wave, and use a filter, typically low pass, but also some other kinds of filters, to remove excess harmonics. On the West Coast synths, a very different approach where they would use a relatively simple waveform, but then use distortion, wave folding, for example, to create more complex harmonics. And then instead of a filter, they would use something called a low pass gate. And this is a combination of voltage-controlled amplifier and voltage-controlled filter that work as one unit, so that as sound gets louder and attacks and decays, it will change its brightness in the same way. And that gives a very organic, natural sound to their synths. So a couple of differences in the approaches. Now, with the MakeNoise Ø-COAST, we have a combination of both East Coast and West Coast. It does track 1 volt per octave through an included MIDI adapter. So you can play this from a MIDI keyboard. You can also hook it up to your DAW of choice like Logic, Cubase, FL Studio, Reason, Ableton, Pro Tools, and run it from a computer via MIDI. It does have a harmonics generator. It does have a low pass gate. It does not have a filter. So in that sense, very similar to West Coast synthesis. So why don't we pull up a picture of this and we'll dive in. I'm going to share my screen with you. So here is a hero shot of the MakeNoise Ø-COAST. And I'll go through some of the features with you. We have a MIDI in adapter that plugs into the jack in the middle of the left side, and we have some MIDI functions below. So that adapter will create a control voltage for things like pitch, and also a gate signal, so that as you press a key, the gate will come on. As you release the key, the gate will stop, and we can use that to control the contour generator in the MakeNoise Ø-COAST. All right. In addition, there's a couple of program buttons, Program A and Program B, and those are used to get into some deeper features within the Ø-COAST that are beyond the scope of this video. The next section I want to talk about is some utilities to help you out. Now, the Program B button does have a second function, which is tap tempo. So if you hit that button, you can set a tempo. That tempo will make the clock flash. There's a little LED, orange LED, to the right of the clock jack that will flash in time with your tempo. You can also clock this to an external tempo source like a sequencer through the tempo input. Now, every time the clock changes, we're going to see below that we have this green rectangle next to a jack. That is a random stepped voltage generator. So it will put out a voltage every time there's a new clock, and it will go up and down randomly. Below that, we have something MakeNoise calls voltage maths. Now, it's essentially a two-input mixer. The two white boxes are the inputs. The input on the right goes through something called an attenuverter. So this is an attenuator or fader, but it has the special property that it can go positive. If you go from noon to 5 o'clock, you'll increase the level. If you go negative, this will create an inverted version of whatever signal is patched into that jack. Now, if you don't have a signal patched into that jack, there's a steady voltage, 8 volt in, so that can act simply as a voltage control for 0 to 8 volts, or if you go left from 12 o'clock counterclockwise, you'll go from 0 to minus 8 volts. There's a little sum box there that lights up to show you the signal level. And after the signals are mixed together, they come out of two outputs, and those two outputs are identical. So you can actually use this voltage mass to split one signal into two, to combine two signals. A few different things you can do with it. All right, the next thing that we have going on here is we have our oscillator section. And you see the big pitch knob, which is used for coarse setting of pitch. And then below that is a little trimmer that allows you to adjust the pitch with a little bit more precision, fine control. Below that, we have the pitch input, which is labeled 1 volt per octave. And so it will track a standard sequencer in Eurorack or a keyboard that like the Arturia BeatStep or KeyStep Pro that will output 1 volt per octave. Next to that, we have a linear FM input. Anytime you see a white box around a jack, that is a control voltage input. Above the pitch knob, we see two outputs, and we know they're outputs because they have an arrow pointing away from the jack. One is for the triangle wave, and the other is the square wave. They're both coming from the same oscillator, but there are two different wave shapes here. The waveform processing comes next. So if you follow the square wave and you follow a line up and over it, you'll see it goes to something called overtone. And overtone is a kind of strange filter that chooses different harmonic structures. So we have in the leftmost position, we have an odd setting that'll give you a kind of a triangle wave or a square wave kind of sound. Then we have a position at 10 o'clock that looks like two lowercase i's, and that's sort of an intermediate position. And then we have the even position about 2 o'clock, and that will give you some more harmonics and different harmonics. And then finally, we have something that looks like two exclamation points, and that will give you even more harmonics. So you can go from something like a very mellow square to a very bright pulse type wave. Now, the overtone can be controlled by an input down the bottom. You see the white box around the overtone jack, and that runs through an attenuator to control how much that input, that control voltage input, is going to affect the overtone control. Below overtone, we have multiply. And this is a kind of wavefolder, which is a kind of distortion. It will add harmonics to your signal. And we have a knob, which the more you turn it up, the more overtones you'll get. Below that, we have an attenuverter for the multiply input. So we can send a CV into that, and then we can attenuvert that signal. And again, an attenuverter, when turned to the right or clockwise, will make your signal stronger, give you a positive amount of that input. And if you turn it counterclockwise from 12 o'clock, you will get a negative signal. So you will have it subtract or take away from wherever the position of the multiply knob is. Now the multiply knob will go up, and that's going to go next to the balance control. So if we look at the balance control in the upper right, we see the left side of the knob is the fundamental, and that is your triangle wave normally. And on the right, we have something called overtone, and that is your square wave through the overtone and multiply wave processors. We also have a balance control that we can control via CV, so you can set the balance to a position and use a control voltage to manipulate the knob. So this is where you blend the sort of low fundamental from the triangle with your wave-folded square wave. And then below that we have the dynamics processor. This is a low-pass gate. And again, that means that as you turn up the dynamics, it gets brighter as you go. And if you have that signal affected by an envelope, that envelope will be brightest at the peak, and as it decays, it will get progressively darker. This feeds a headphone jack via another trimmer just to adjust the headphone output. That also serves as a line output as well. Now, there are two envelope generators here. The one in the center is called slope. And slope has a rise or attack control and a fall or release control. The cycle button allows you to set slope into a repeating mode that will just keep looping the envelope. Below the fall control, we see a third knob that allows you to adjust how that rise and fall are, how they are shaped. So do they have a linear up and down? Do they have a kind of logarithmic up and logarithmic down, or an exponential up and an exponential down? So you can adjust the shape and you'll get different kinds of envelopes and different kinds of envelope times, excuse me, based on the setting of that. You have also rise and fall times that can be varied with the time CV input. And the other thing about slope is that it normally feeds the multiply attenuverter control. So that's typically what slope is going to do for you, is change your waveform. Now the final piece to this is the contour generator, and that is an ADS generator, attack, decay, sustain. Onset controls the attack time. Sustain, of course, controls the sustain level. And decay controls the decay time, but it also controls the release time. So we have one knob to control both functions here. Again, we have the ability to change from a linear to an exponential slope. And the contour normally affects the dynamics level. So this is the one we'd use to shape our volume dynamics, where slope will shape our waveform. There is also a CV control over decay time. So that's basically it. Let's dig into a couple more functions and I'll show you them with an actual Ø-COAST.